narrow dirt road to the log cabin church in Cane Ridge was crowded with hundreds of wagons, horses, and even people on foot. It seemed as if the whole countryside was literally descending upon this place. Even as it continued to pour down rain, making a mess of the road, people came by the thousands. The population of Cane Ridge was growing by the hour as the surrounding area was transformed into a new community made up entirely of tents, some having traveling for over 100 miles. They came with their entire families and arrived with their own provisions. It was an awesome sight to behold, especially for Barton Stone, the pastor of this Presbyterian church. The United States was barely 25 years old, and Kentucky had just joined the Union. The days of Jonathan Edwards and the Great Awakening had already begun to fade as the nation expanded. The moral foundations that America once knew were slowly eroding. Churches were few and far in this vast land. This was the wild frontier, where the only rule of law was a rope or a gun. It was a time when wickedness abounded and very few people professed real faith. The distance also made it impractical to expect people to come weekly or even monthly to the church house. Communion still carried great weight in the hearts of the religious people. Barton Stone would use this as a draw for his camp meeting. That weekend, it would open with a service on Friday night. It would be followed by a day of fasting and praying and preaching. Then on Sunday, communion would be given to all who wished to participate. He expected a large crowd that weekend, larger than the church could possibly hold, and so he chose to use the church for prayer and communion, but the services themselves, they would be held outdoors in the adjacent field. There, he raised a covered platform, constructed it using timber from some of the nearby trees. He invited 17 ministers from different denominations to help minister to the crowd. He felt that he was prepared. As evening approached, the rain continued to pour. It put a damper on that opening service. But those who were brave enough to walk through the rain, they found safe harbor inside this church. The crowd that evening was small enough to fit comfortably. That night, the house was full as Stone greeted the people. The service itself, he wrote, was rather uneventful. That was the calm before the storm. The next day, the sky had cleared. The first service took place there at the covered platform, and thousands gathered around. There was a tangible excitement that you could feel in the air, and the crowd continued to grow throughout the day. By that afternoon, it was evident there was far more people than they had anticipated. Where had they all come from? There were at least 20,000 men, women, and children on the grounds. It became immediately apparent that neither the house nor the platform would be adequate enough to minister to such a large crowd. Stone dispatched the preachers who had joined him to minister. He dispatched them throughout the multitude. It was an awesome display of humility and unity. There, Presbyterian, Methodist, and even Baptist preachers set out into the fields to contend for a harvest. Stumps, carriages, even fallen trees became platforms for the preachers as they ministered to different sections of the crowd. Sometimes as many as 8 different ministers would be preaching at one single time, yet there was no confusion. The message was simple. It was salvation through faith. The call was to repent of worldly ways and to turn to Jesus Christ as the only way to the Father. So many heeded the call to salvation that they were unable to count them all. In the crowd that afternoon, there was a mother standing there with her 2 teenage daughters at her side. They were listening intently to a minister who stood before them on a stump. He preached with powerful words about the deadly consequences of sin. As they listened, the 2 daughters were seized suddenly with conviction. They cried out from the depths of their soul and then fell to the ground like 2 dead women. This was an awesome sight and a new sight for everyone in the crowd. The mother, being a devout woman, she became quite distressed. She began frantically fanning their faces in an attempt to wake them up, but to no avail. It was an hour later when one of her daughters finally stirred, just long enough to cry out with this piercing scream, "Mercy, Lord, mercy." She then fell back into her trance-like state. Both girls lay there motionless for hours on the ground with the most awful look of terror on their faces. From time to time, they would wake just enough to cry out for mercy once more before returning to that agonizing slumber. The wretched despair that they carried on their countenance lasted for a few hours before it finally broke and was replaced with the most beautiful heavenly smile. "Precious Jesus," one shouted as she rose to her feet, the whole of her being transformed. She was filled with such fire and zeal that containing it was impossible. She opened her mouth and began to preach the gospel to all those who surrounded her. Her voice belted across the crowd as if it was amplified by a supernatural force. It caused quite the stir, and a new crowd began to gather around her. Her appeal was eloquent, solemn, bold, and free. As she preached, the audience around her was hit by that same phenomenon she had just experienced. They fell to the ground by hundreds all at once. They hit the ground like trees being felled by one powerful swing of an axe. Men and women were falling everywhere, taken down as men slain in battle, bodies laid across the grounds, motionless on the ground for hours. That is, until they stirred to life with deep groans or shrieks. All over the field, you could hear the desperate cries and calls for mercy from thousands at a time. The scene was inexplicable to the analytical mind. In the crowd was a local physician. He'd come out of curiosity, but that curiosity had now turned to mockery. He joked to a young woman that should he be affected, she would have to make sure that he didn't hurt himself on his way to the ground. However, as he mocked, he became more and more uncomfortable. Soon it was too much for him to handle. The man tore off into the woods, running for his life. He didn't make it far before he too was struck down. He lay there on the ground until he fully submitted his life to the Lord. As the sun set that night, the preaching continued. Periodically, the crowd would be moved into singing a familiar hymn. It would start at one end of the camp, and then it would move like a wave throughout the entire multitude. The sound of thousands of voices singing in the open air had a powerful effect on many. It flowed like a mighty torrent through the surrounding hills. The singing seemed as if it came not from the mouth, but from the very depths of the soul. Such music silenced everything and attracted everyone's attention. It was a heavenly sound no one ever grew tired of hearing. The meeting on Saturday, it had exceeded Stone's expectations. Though the services were set to conclude on Sunday, few wished to leave. The meeting continued through the following week and might have gone longer had the crowd not exhausted the resources of the town. Word about Cane Ridge spread quickly around the nation. As a result, more and more camp meetings began to spring up across America's frontier. Though none ever matched the attendance of Cane Ridge, the impact they made in America was significant. This is how the West was won. Each camp meeting that took place after Cane Ridge began with a similar prayer: Lord, make it like Cane Ridge. The story of Cane Ridge is one that seems too spectacular to be true. Had it not been for the many eyewitnesses who recorded the event in great detail, it might be easy to dismiss it all as a tall tale. There's no denying that something supernatural took place here in the cane fields of Kentucky. The camp meeting shook several denominations, including Presbyterian, Methodist, and Baptist. This revival ignited a fire that swept through the western frontier like wildfire through dry brush. It set the stage for America's next great awakening. Barton Stone testified, "To give a true description of this meeting cannot be done. It would border on the marvelous." The story of Cane Ridge is one that stirs something deep within the spirit. Every year, thousands of people still make the trek to Cane Ridge, Kentucky to visit the old log cabin meeting house. Some come in hopes of capturing a burning ember of that ancient fire. All leave with the same prayer resounding in their hearts: Lord, do it again, and do it like Cane Ridge.